Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Who Has to Know or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by TrueFreak89, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Who Has to Know? Chapter 5. Friday afternoon came around all too soon for Raelle. She sat in her last period of the day staring at the clock on the wall as it inched ever closer to 3 o'clock. Her calculus teacher droned on at the front of the class, but Raelle hadn't taken in a single word the man had said for the last 45 minutes. Raelle tabbed her pencil against the side of her desk, her eyes glued to the clock. She had 10 minutes before she was supposed to meet Scylla in the school library. They'd exchanged an email agreeing when and where to meet, but other than that, they hadn't spoken since Monday. Raelle had hoped they could forget about what happened, that they could move on and ignore that it ever happened, but it wasn't so simple. Doubt was growing in Raelle's mind, festering away inside of her and spreading like a cancer. Raelle had reached a point where she couldn't ignore what happened between them anymore, and she needed to talk to Scylla about it. They'd both been drunk, but it didn't stop the gnawing guilt that Raelle felt in the pit of her stomach when she thought about pushing Scylla up against the bathroom door and sticking her hand down her pants. Raelle was going out of her mind thinking about it. She was worried she'd taken advantage of her, and that was why Scylla hadn't confronted her about any of it. The bell sounded, shaking Raelle out of her thoughts. She said goodbye to Tally and Abigail on her way out of the classroom. They both had cheer practice, so they took off in the opposite direction, leaving Raelle to trudge along to her locker alone. Scylla was already there, shoving her textbooks inside her locker. She caught sight of Raelle and slammed it shut, the hint of a frown playing on her brow. Raelle's stomach lurched. She dug her head and walked up to her own locker. "You still okay for working on the project?" Raelle asked, her eyes staring straight ahead. "Yes," Scylla answered curtly. And that was the full extent of their conversation as they made their way to the library. Given that it was a Friday afternoon, most of the tables were empty. Scylla chose one near the back. The two of them sat down and Scylla pulled her biology notes out of her bag, while Raelle sat twiddling her thumbs. Scylla's frown finally broke through. "Do you have any notes at all?" "Nope." Raelle popped the P at the end. She swung back in her chair, ignoring the menacing glare the librarian sent her way. "I told you, I don't need 'em." Raelle was right. She didn't need any notes to remember what they've covered, and that only infuriated Scylla more as they worked through their project. Raelle was a slacker, but she was also one of those people who didn't need to study to pass a test. It wasn't fair. Scylla?" Raelle rubbed at her neck after they'd been working for close to an hour. She chewed on her lip, trying to come up with the right way to ask whether she'd taken advantage of her the other night. "About the other night." "I don't want to talk about it," Scylla said, without lifting her eyes from her notes. Her tone left little room to argue with her, so Raelle let it drop like she asked. Not long after that, Byron and Porter turned up at the library looking for Scylla. They were both dressed in their lacrosse uniforms and carrying their kit bags over their shoulders. Porter's blonde curls were stuck to his head with sweat, and he wore a huge grin as his eyes landed on Scylla. "Hey, babe," he greeted Scylla. Leaning over the back of her chair, he pressed a kiss to Scylla's cheek. "Porter, you're all gross," she snapped, pushing him away. "We're here to pick you up. Let's go." "I want to get home and shower," said Byron, moving to pick up Scylla's bag from the floor. "You could always shower at school." Scylla snatched her bag from his hands. "And we're not finished yet." "Well, Porter's not coming back for your ass later. We have plans. So move your butt. You can finish this at home. Rael can come too. Right, Rael? Rael stared up at Byron with something close to panic in her eyes. The last thing she wanted was to go to Scylla's house with her. Actually, Great! We'll order pizza, said Byron, completely ignoring Rael and Scylla's protests. Porter, fetch. Scylla glared daggers at her boyfriend. Porter, don't you dare. Scylla didn't get time to finish her threat as Porter scooped her up, throwing her over his shoulder like a fireman. Scylla yelped. Put me down, you freak! Scylla slapped at his back, but it was more playful than violent. Rael glanced away from the couple and packed up her stuff while Byron saw to Scylla's things. He slung her bag over his shoulder and followed Porter as he carried Scylla out of the library. Rael trailed after them. The thought of her promise to Isadora was the only thing that kept her following Porter and the twins out to the parking lot. Porter placed Scylla down once they reached his car. He pulled his car keys out of his pocket and handed Byron his kit bag to throw in the trunk with his. Scylla climbed into the front passenger seat while Byron was distracted. He spotted her up front and cursed at her. I called shotgun, Syl. It's my boyfriend's car, bye. She shot him a smirk, but might as well have just flipped him off. Byron glared at his sister as he climbed into the back with Rael. Scylla glanced in the rearview mirror and caught Rael's gaze. She quickly looked away, her cheeks burning up. She reached out for Porter, running her fingers through the back of his hair, where it was starting to curl like a top. Babe, your hair is getting too long. You need a cut. It just gives you something to hold on to, Porter winked at her. In the back, Byron rolled his eyes. Turning to Rael, he brought his fingers up to his mouth and made a gagging motion. Rael bit back a grin. She liked Byron. Unlike Scylla, he wasn't up his own ass. Porter pulled up outside a nondescript 2-story house with a neat front yard. It looked the same as the houses either side of it, except for the hanging baskets full of flowers either side of the door and the wooden swing on the front porch. Porter lived directly across the street. He pressed a kiss to Scylla's cheek and promised to be over later, after dinner with his family. He waited until the others climbed out before pulling into his driveway. Rael followed the twins into their house. It was nice inside, homely. There were pictures of the twins and their adoptive mother all over. Byron's lacrosse trophies were lined up on the shelf in the living room, and Rael spotted a bunch of certificates and ribbons belonging to Scylla in the hall. Rael hovered by the front door, feeling like a spare part while Scylla hung her coat up and Byron disappeared into the kitchen. Syl, Mama Kasia left us money for pizza. Rael, are you staying for dinner? No, Rael called back to him. No thanks. She wanted to finish the work and get out of here as fast as was humanly possible. Scylla headed for the stairs. She was halfway up them when she realized Rael wasn't following her. She turned and stopped. Are you coming or what? She snapped at the other girl. Rael clenched her teeth, biting back a scathing comment, and followed her up. Scylla's room was pristine, with not a single thing out of place. It was a far cry from Rael's own room, which had laundry strewn about the floor and books and papers piled up on her desk. The room wasn't overly girly. The walls were a pale yellow, and there were a handful of stuffed animals sitting on a shelf over Scylla's bed. There were more pictures of the twins in here, and pictures with Porter in them too. Rael's eyes lingered on a framed photograph of the 3 of them that had to have been taken back in the 1st grade. They'd been friends for a long time. Rael wondered when that friendship between Scylla and Porter had changed into something else, and how Byron had handled his sister and his best friend hooking up. Scylla sat up at her desk, pulling out what they'd already done in the library from her bag. She pushed a chair towards Rael before dragging the laundry hamper over and using it as a seat. Scylla's desk was smaller than the table they'd sat at opposite ends of in the library, and Rael found herself far too close to the other girl for comfort. They'd barely started, picking up where they left off in the library, when their arms brushed and Scylla reared back like she'd been stung. What the hell? She snapped. What? I didn't do anything. Rael stood up so fast she almost knocked a chair over. You touched my arm. You knocked it into my arm first. No, I didn't. What, like you didn't kiss me first the other night? Rael shouted, regretting the words the instant they left her mouth. Scylla's eyes widened in disbelief. You kissed me, she said, standing up to stare Rael down. Like hell I did. You kissed me. Riel took a step forward and then remembered what that had led to last time. She took 2 hasty steps back and shook her head. Whatever, I'm done. Riel snatched her bag up from the floor. She stalked towards the door, but Scylla beat her to it. The other girl grabbed her wrist as she reached for the doorknob. We haven't finished, and I'm not failing this class because of you. Get off me! Riel yanked her arm back with a snarl. If you're so smart, you can finish it by yourself. Fine, snapped Scylla. Fine. Riel growled in the other girl's face, and something snapped. One moment they were glaring at each other, chests heaving with anger, and then next, Riel had Scylla pushed up against the door, her hands pinned above her shoulders by her wrist, and they were kissing. Scylla's mouth was hot and insistent as her tongue slipped past Riel's parted lips, just like it had last Friday night. She ground their hips together in a way that made Riel gasp. She let go of one of Scylla's wrists, her hand finding the other girl's hip. Scylla reached down, guiding Riel's hand to where she wanted it. Riel got the message. She popped open the top button of Scylla's jeans and shoved her hand into her pants. Scylla was already wet as Riel's fingers slid over her folds. Fuck, she gasped into the other girl's mouth as Riel's thumb found her clit. Scylla threw her head back against the door, arching into Riel's touch as she slipped her 2 fingers inside of her. Riel's lips found the pulse point in Scylla's neck. She nipped and sucked at it while her fingers worked inside of Scylla, drawing her closer and closer to the edge. Scylla let out ragged gasps and moans as her hips moved to meet Riel's fingers. With Riel still pinning one of her hands above her head, she reached out with the other, burying her fingers in Riel's platinum locks and tugging on her braids. Then, Riel's thumb flicked over her clit again, and Scylla saw stars. She buried her face in Riel's shoulder to keep from crying out as she came. Scylla stayed right where she was, as little aftershocks rocked her body. Riel waited until Scylla stopped rocking her hips to pull her fingers out, and they both stood there, breathless and staring at each other, unsure of what would come next. Scylla decided for them. She shoved Riel, sending her tumbling back. Riel's eyes widened as if coming out of some kind of daze. She threw her hands up. Scylla, Shut up. Scylla pushed her again, knocking Riel on her ass on Scylla's bed. She climbed on top of the other girl before Riel could get another word out and crushed their mouths together again. Riel melted into the kiss, her body sinking into the mattress as Scylla settled herself on top of her. Scylla slipped a hand between their tightly pressed bodies, deftly unbuckled Riel's belt and slipped her hand into her pants. Riel hadn't been with anyone since last summer, when she had hooked up with a girl from the session while she'd been visiting her grandparents. It hadn't meant much. The girl had been pretty, and she'd laughed at Riel's jokes. She'd also been great in bed. But that had been months ago, and Riel didn't realize how tight she was until Scylla slipped a single digit inside of her, and she clenched down around it. She gasped in Scylla's mouth, her fingers digging into the other girl's shoulders, as Scylla added a second finger, stretching her out. Fuck, Riel cursed. Her hips canting up as Scylla began moving her fingers in and out of her, curling them when they were inside. Riel might have been embarrassed by her needy moans, had she not been so close to coming. It didn't take long once Scylla picked up the pace. Riel came undone, painfully quick. She shuddered as Scylla pulled out of her, and they locked eyes. The same thick tension that had hung between them all week was back, but it was a different type of tension, and almost palpable. Scylla was still straddling her, their faces only inches apart. Riel's gaze dipped to her mouth. She really wanted to kiss the other girl again. There was a lot she wanted to do to Scylla Ramshorn. Riel had never been great at impulse control, so she sat up and kissed her. Their lips barely met again when Byron called up from downstairs. "Syl, pizza's here!" "Coming!" Scylla shouted, and a deep blush spread over her cheeks as she scrambled off the bed. She walked into the ensuite, closing the door behind her. Riel flopped back on the bed with a sigh. She covered her face with her hands and groaned into them. What the hell was she thinking? She'd screwed Scylla, a girl she couldn't stand. Twice now. Twice! Riel sat up and buckled her belt as Scylla came back out of the bathroom. She tied her hair back and washed her hands and face. Her cheeks were flushed red. She didn't say a word to Riel as she headed for the door. She couldn't even look at her. Raelle scooped up her backpack from the floor by Scylla's desk and followed her out. Downstairs, they found Porter standing in the kitchen, holding a stack of pizza boxes. "Hey, babe," he greeted Scylla with a kiss to her cheek, and Raelle's stomach lurched. She'd forgotten all about Scylla's boyfriend. Suddenly faced with Porter in the flesh, Raelle's guilt felt like it might swallow her whole. "I thought you were having dinner at home," said Scylla, steadfastly ignoring Raelle altogether. "I did. Byron texted me and asked me to go for pizza," Porter explained, helping himself to a slice from the top box on the stack. "You just ate," Scylla rolled her eyes. "I'm a growing boy." Porter grinned at her with a mouthful of pizza. "I need to eat." Scylla said. Across the other side of the kitchen, Byron pulled out 4 plates from one of the cupboards. "Raelle, you're staying, right?" he asked, although she'd already said she wasn't. "I should let you guys eat," she said, shifting from one foot to another and fiddling with the strap of her backpack. She and Scylla hadn't finished their project yet, but Raelle was past caring. She would take the fail. "Don't be silly, there's plenty for everyone," he insisted, shepherding the blonde towards the dining room. Scylla trailed after them with an expression that made her look like she was chewing a wasp. Porter brought up the rear and the pizzas. Raelle sat at the dining room table with the other 3 teens, wishing she could be anywhere else at all. She picked idly at the toppings on her pizza in a world of her own. Raelle was still trying to process what happened upstairs. She might have convinced herself nothing actually happened had it not been for the telltale stickiness between her legs. Scylla sat across the table from the blonde, her eyes glued to her plate. Byron and Porter did all the talking, and most of the eating, while the 2 girls sulked in silence. "Are you 2 finished your project?" Byron asked, trying to include them in the conversation. "Not yet." "Yes," Raelle answered firmly, talking over Scylla. Their eyes met briefly before Scylla ducked her head. "We're all done. Thanks for the food, but I should get going." Raelle stood up from the table, ignoring her half-eaten pizza slice. "Are you sure?" asked Porter. "We're having movie night if you want to stay." He smiled at Raelle, trying to be nice. He had no idea what Raelle had just done with his girlfriend, what she had done to her. "Thanks, but my mom is expecting me," said Raelle. She shook her head as Scylla went to stand. "I can see myself out. See you guys on Monday." Raelle didn't wait around long enough for Scylla to object. She got out of that house as fast as she could without actually breaking into a run. Her house was empty when Raelle got home. Her mom was working night shift again, and her dad would be playing poker with his buddies for most of the night. Raelle was grateful for the peace and quiet as she slung her bag on the bedroom floor and kicked off her tennis shoes. Padding barefoot into the bathroom, she peeled off her clothes and dropped them in the laundry hamper by the door. She turned on the shower and stepped under the water once it was hot enough. Raelle took a washcloth and used it to clean between her legs, getting rid of the uncomfortable stickiness that had settled there. Under the hot spray of the shower, Raelle's thoughts soon drifted back to earlier with Scylla. The weight of the other girl's body on top of her, her fingers buried deep within Raelle. Raelle dropped the cloth, her own fingers slipping inside of herself. It was messed up, getting herself off to the memory of Scylla inside of her. But Raelle couldn't stop herself. She came for the second time that night, her head pressed up against the cool tiled wall, her hips shuddering and her breaths coming in short, sharp rasps. Shame flooded over her the second she pulled her fingers out of herself. She turned and slammed back against the shower cubicle, holding her head in her hands. What was she doing? She couldn't stand Scylla, so what was she doing, getting off, thinking about her? Raelle cleaned herself up for a second time before shutting the water off and stepping out of the shower. She wrapped a fluffy towel around herself, padded back to her room, and threw herself on her bed with a sigh. Biting her lip, she picked up her phone and typed up a quick message to Glory, asking for Scylla's number. She made up a story about needing to get in touch with Scylla about her biology project, and Glory was only happy to help. Raelle saved Scylla's number to her contacts and sat staring at it for the longest time, before she swallowed her pride and sent her a message saying they needed to talk. She jumped when her phone pinged, a few moments later, a new message from Scylla flashing up on the screen. Her fingers shook as she reached out to open it. "Scylla, I can't talk right now. Talk when Porter is gone." Riel tossed her phone aside with a huff and buried her face in her pillow with a groan. God damn Scylla Ramshorn. She thought the whole world revolved around her. Riel hated Scylla, so why couldn't she stop thinking about her? She let out another groan. It was hours later before Riel's phone went off again. It was Scylla asking if she was free to talk. Riel replied with a simple yes. She almost jumped out of her skin when her phone rang and Scylla's name appeared on the screen. Riel hadn't thought Scylla meant actually talking. She wasn't prepared for that. Riel let it ring and ring until her phone finally sent it to voicemail and Scylla hung up. She called again straight away. Riel answered this time. What happened back there? She said, wasting no time with saying hello. She heard Scylla take a sharp breath on the other end of the line. I can't talk. Porter's still here. What? What was the point in you even calling? Riel demanded, her irritation reaching boiling point. He'll be here all night, said Scylla, ignoring Riel's question altogether. Can we talk tomorrow? In person? Riel bit back a curse. She rolled onto her back with her phone pressed to her ear as she considered it. Yeah, sure. When and where? It was Scylla's turn to fall silent for a moment. Riel almost thought she had hung up until she finally replied with, Porter and Byron will be playing video games at our house all day. Can we meet at yours? The question sent an unexpected image of Scylla lying beneath her in her bed, flashing through Riel's mind. She clenched her eyes shut and bit the inside of her cheek as she nodded, and then remembered Scylla couldn't see her. Fine, I'll text you the address. Come by any time after 1. Okay, see you then, said Scylla. Riel hung up with a grunt and threw her arm over her face. What the hell had she just agreed to? Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.